because I've like, I guess I could save some of it for the interview, but it is just kind of crazy that like, just really like, I wonder how you feel just be going through a situation where like you've been saying this things for so long, and then like now in 2020, like it's just like, oh my god, hey, like this stuff is happening. It's like, yeah, no shit, I've been saying this for fucking ever.
Yeah, and I would say it's also a bit unfortunate because it's not the way I want to go. It's we have to do things before we get to these points. Once we get to these points, emotion gets so involved that it's really hard to navigate anything productive.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I feel we're getting into it. I feel we're getting into it, and I think we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
So let me see. So you have audio on your side just in case. What we're going to do? I have this cat in the background. And hopefully this
I
doesn't.
have both of us separately just in case.
Okay, cool. All right. All right. Let me set up. I hope that doesn't make sound. Like this cat just keeps. I'm like doing it over at a buddy's house because like she's not home, and I try to put the cat away inside of her spot, and then she just is like makes noise. I'm like, stop it, shut up. But it should be fine.
We'll make it. I have us in separate tracks, so if the cat makes noises when I'm talking, it won't matter. I can just keep it out.
Keep it. All right, cool, awesome. All right, all right. So I know, like I've seen like we're probably gonna um, rehash some old stuff. Like I kind of wanted to just like not go there, just like oh, like the previous stuff. But I think just for a different audience who might not have heard you before, I might try to hash a little bit of it of the past of like, hey, what you saw before and stuff like that. But I don't want to focus too much on that because there's so many videos of that of you explaining that.
Of course.
But is there anything in regards to? I guess I was want to ask this too. It's like, is there anything that you would want to talk about that wasn't mentioned in the tweets that you have seen, or was that basically it that that you
We
wanted
can
to
we
talk?
can talk a little bit about what the point of those tweets were. I think the point
Yeah,
of it has gotten lost.
that
So
that's one thing that I really wanted to focus on too because it was like I really want to know like the headspace and what made you kind of do it on that day, and what was the kind of deciding factors. And I know they said like with Freddie Gray and stuff like that, but it's like there's a methodology like over time, but I really want to kind of like focus on and what kind of puts people in that certain mind space to be like this is a fucking day,
sure.
you know and then I'll let same thing for you in regards to kind of taking it where you want to go.
Yeah.
um
The thing is, the the narrow focus and perspective that I have is uh, so, so when you know a lot about a subject, you
yeah,
then realize it's so broad that I can't actually explain any of this to anyone. So I have to go in these narrow routes that are important to you
yeah,
because I don't even know where I mean, like, primary issues to me are like, I mean, the first chapter in my book that is my philosophy is there's no free will. And
yeah,
so once you start off with I need to have the premise established already that there's no free will for you to really carry out my philosophies. And then how much of a debate do we all need to get into with everybody about free will before I can even advance to step two? So I kind of like to explain particular things, like if you think private prisons are a big deal, I'll argue
oh
with you
yeah,
about why they're not, or things like that are, and I think if you want to structure, I've realized now that I follow my educational path. Like what
okay.
I'm saying is really what I'm learning at that time, and
Mhm.
so I'm applying these things to my life and seeing what they mean. So obviously, when I am a very like a young master's student at Joe Rogan first time.
Yeah,
I'm early in my PhD the second time, and now I'm finished. So there are a lot of like each step I'm in a very different mentality. Whereas now, all in a pursuit of solutions, but now I'm in this space where I guess I've become very data driven,
Yeah.
And it's making me it gets me in battles with people who agree with me ideologically but don't understand why they agree with me and don't understand what the facts mean.
Okay. Okay.
So there's a lot of tough things to get into. Like if you, I mean, just I think there'd be a thorough discussion just on just talking about black crime in a city versus disproportionate police use. What does that mean? Where are the police disproportionate? Because they're not disproportionate when it comes to violence. They're disproportionate when it comes to crime, which is very different things.
Because crime could be literally that's anything that could be
Any
something
violation.
non-violent. Like that's like stop, like the thing elements of stop and frisk. It's like
Right.
crime goes up, but it depends on. But violent crime is completely different. And it's
Right.
I actually wanted to kind of get into that with you in regards to like the data on percentages of what cops actually get called on out to that are violent crime compared to the other percentage, which is I think it was like 96% of calls that cops go out on are non-violent crimes.
Sure. Yeah.
And then the other 4%, like actually like it's 3% that's like violent crime, and then there's a final like 1% of 0.09% that's like serious violent crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also I think also talking about the methodology of policing where we first started. And I think the methodology from where we first started, which was actually, slave catchers to black codes to enforcing Jim Crow, it's like, does a whole foundation have to be torn down because, they were originally started off with bringing revenue back to the state.
Mm-hmm.
So like if everything is regulated around that, then any training or body cameras that you're doing, you're basically just throwing a body camera on a slave catcher.
Sure.
Recording them to bring the revenue back to the state better, but still they're looking out for revenue and state instead of over people.
Sure.
So yeah, and I'm gonna talk a little bit. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Standing Rock, just very very little about it, just because I think that's the way that I'll introduce. But I'm not gonna go into it much. It's gonna be more about things that I saw, more about the methodology between seeing that there were vets that were going out to fight a war, and this was the first time that they saw a war that was justified, and really seeing the split in regards to ideologies in the liberal, like the conservative and liberal vets as the same as the liberal and conservative police officers. So that's where that connection is. So if I touch upon that, that's mainly where the connection is, because I really want to talk about the fact that why is it that there was more of how do we switch that, where it's more the liberal voices are the ones that aren't silenced and more the kind of conservatives are kind of switched on. So how do you switch that dilemma?
Sure.
And so that's basically, I just want to let a little bit that I will be touching with that, but that's the reason why I'm touching on Standing Rock.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I'm going to introduce you saying that, like, it's been a long time since.
No worries.
Yeah, met you there.
I learned a lot there too.
Cool. All right, so you ready for this?
Yep.
All right, cool. So 3, 2, 1. And 3, 2, 1. Hey, everyone. I have a really exciting person to talk with today. His name is Michael Wood Jr., and it's actually been some time since I've had a chance to speak with him and actually see him. If you look at him online, he is I guess very pronounced whistleblower from the Baltimore PD. I don't want to go too deep into it because I want him to introduce himself a little bit. But I guess the first time that I met him was in Standing Rock. So let me just introduce Michael Wood Jr. to the podcast. Hey, how you doing, man?
Hey, what's up, Emmy? It's good to talk to you again.
I know. You
Good to see your smiling face.
I've been smiling, especially in these crazy times during this pandemic, smiles go very far, which is good. And I think the last time I actually saw you was we were basically coming up with a strategy in a casino hallway on how to get home from North Dakota.
Yeah, that was a protest turned into a FEMA operation unexpectedly. And I learned a lot of lessons in that process, and I'm glad everyone did get home safely, more importantly than anything else. So, praise be to whatever your choice of word there is, and that we all survived that encounter and learned a lot from it.
And it's surprising because everything, it seemed like there was a force that was trying to stop this from happening. So it almost immediately became this survival mission. And when all communication broke down, it is kind of crazy, especially in the middle of one of the worst snowstorms I've ever seen. It was probably one of the strongest senses of community that I've ever seen.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's kind of weird. I feel like that's a good point, and there was some judgment from like the state and from outsiders about like what was happening during this operation, and it wasn't even like we were part of the outside world. It was you were totally alone in this and had to make do with the resources that you had there. All there was each other,
yeah,
period. And I think a lot of different interests had to be put aside for the focus on that at the end, regardless of which side or perspective you were coming from.
exactly. There was a moment I remember we were at the casino, and it was the first moment that I really saw this. And everyone was packed inside of the I think it was like where you check in, and I was just hearing over the. Hold on for a second. Let me go back. It's saying that there's no sound detected. So let me see what's going on.
No worries. I got you good, just for the record.
You do okay. Um, okay, I'll just keep going. I kind of step back a little bit. So I think one of the crazy things about that situation was I remember we were all packed into the place where you check in, and I remember I kept hearing over the intercom that they were making announcements saying, all right, somebody with a truck can take 3 people to the airport. And then 5 minutes later, another person has volunteered their vehicle to take 6 people to the airport, or this. And it was going on loop that you just realized that the tools and resources started becoming each other. Like we all became our own instruments for enacting and producing some type of change in the system.
Yeah, I don't want to start feeling bitter. I feel a little bitter because like the state had abandoned us. If we go back to it,
Yeah.
all of our communications were being. My phones would not work ever since this whole thing started. After it was over, suddenly everything worked again. Yeah, there was hindrances where I have an ongoing lawsuit that can't get into too much, but they had put out warrants for my arrest and all kinds of stuff out there, and they had closed down the hospital. They shut down the bridge that was the one to the local hospital. Nobody was around. They were closing off roads, not telling any of us. And I had direct lines of communication with the Army Corps of Engineers, and it was he was even being thrown out of the loop because he was cooperating with us in any way, shape, or form. And it was just like they wanted to stack everything against us so that we looked very poor coming out of there.
Oh yeah. It's I went there with like a truckload of equipment. And I remember when I came home, I literally just had this shirt on my back as I was walking back to my place. Like
That's great. It's
everything.
wild. Wait, that is a common story for the last people remaining.
No, but it was one of it was actually the place that I really understood and really was grounded in protest. And I think it's changed my mind on what protesting is, because I now believe it's for me, it's different. I don't really believe in just marching in solidarity. I believe in you have to protest against some type of resistance. because I think protest has to be visible, and it has to be, something that someone could compare. Like right now during these protests, especially right now, sorry to kind of jump ahead a little bit. It's There has to be a protest against what you are protesting against, and especially during these last, I think, 3 weeks. It's funny that we've been protesting police brutality, and then within these last 3 weeks, there's been over 650 tapes just on this one link of police brutality, because you have to show that it's visible and that people can see it.
Yeah, I understand all that. I get lost when it comes to the protesting and what is actually effective,
Mhm.
and I I don't want to get too much into how people feel about something when there is a mission that needs to be achieved. And whether I agree with any of the particular missions or not, it's the same way in Standing Rock. So, one thing about Standing Rock is people were there for different reasons.
Yeah.
So, I was there purely as a response to state violence.
Mhm.
I'm not an environmentalist. I don't care about that. I just don't, like straight up. I'll be honest. I don't care about that. Some people were there because of Native American issues, going back to whether the dispute over ownership of the land. I don't get into that either. I don't really care about that. I think ownership of land is drawing an arbitrary timeline and saying that this point in time is right. I mean, unless we go back to wherever we started in our little cluster of Africa, every people that is alive today crushed and colonized another people in order to be where they are. I don't think any particular line is the right place where we can draw those issues. So
Mhm.
I'm more concerned about these bigger things that we can see right in front of us. If there are people peacefully conducting civil disobedience in the way of corporate profiteering for some issue, and they have a legitimate issue, they had a legitimate environmental concern. That, I mean, whether you agree with the final conclusion or not, it's a legitimate discussion.
Right.
And then you have legitimate issues about who actually owns the rights to those lands and whether the state can come in and do that. These are legitimate issues. So
Mhm.
then, if somebody's going to go and use the violence of state to be the initiating violence on somebody, I have a huge problem. But we have to come in and recognize that maybe it's a level of where I come from in policing and in the Marine Corps. But if you initiate the violence, I'm responding.
Right.
And I don't care which way that is. If I was donning a if somebody wanted to invade our country, I would put on a uniform in a heartbeat once again and say, no, I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. I'm
Yeah.
anti-violence as a core principle. Now, sure, I'm a bully in response to it, and that can be my flaw, and you can judge it, whatever. I don't care.
Mhm.
So the idea of having a mission, what is your actual principle, and not getting caught up. And I think where we are now, where media and infiltrators have really taken away the purpose of the thing. And I saw that start in Standing Rock,
Yeah.
where we had a serious mission at hand, and I saw that there was arguments literally going on while we were trying to rescue people about how somebody was talking to a woman who was in power or something like that. And I'm just like, I do not have time for this shit, nor do I care one way, shape, or form when there's people down there and we have an actual mission to accomplish.
Right.
So, I mean, I definitely have some varied perspectives when it comes to my response to the principle of violence and not adhering to ideologies beyond the principle.
Mhm. I totally see that. Totally see that.
So I
Um,
will piss everybody off at some point in time. It's inevitable.
Look, pissing people off sometimes just means that they're paying attention. So that's, I don't usually say that's a bad thing. And usually they'll get pissed off if feelings are getting involved. Um, I want to start back a little bit because I didn't actually fully introduce you, and I kind of give a little bit of background about you. So you started off in the Marine Corps. Kind of tell me a little bit how you got into that. What was your methodology in deciding that that's what you wanted to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up poor, mixed neighborhoods, under Section 8's kind of stuff. And I grew up in an era. I feel like this era has been lost, and it's kind of mind blowing to me. I think anybody in their late 30s to early 40s kind of will feel the same way I did. We grew up watching Sanford and Son and Martin and Good Times. We had all of this stuff like in our core from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And we read X-Men, we had Storm, we really did have a broad range of diversity, and it wasn't even discussed. It was just accepted as the normal thing, especially in the lower classes. There was
Mhm.
this I mean, I think it was very clear to people when we were growing up that the Dukes of Hazzard and the Bloods were the same people, just with it, just coming from a different culture, both recognizing that the enemy was the state, not each another poor person. So sure, the Dukes of Hazzard are the good old boys. They're coming from their weird place, and they're not going to see the blood, but the blood's going to not see the Dixie guy the same way. But what I clearly understood was that these were people in the same position against the state.
Mhm.
And they recognized the state control over liberty was a bad thing, and that's what they wanted to fight against. It was kind of a response to the state. So, growing up in this era of kind of racial blindness and everybody getting along in a very positive way, I look back on it certainly fondly. And as I came up, poor people go to the military to get out of the low class. So the police and the military are, it's the harsh way to say it, but they're essentially volunteering to be a mercenary to jump class. It's
Yeah.
long been the truth. That's why the Irish are a very prominent part of police lore, because they were an oppressed people at the time, and the way they could get from the low class to the middle class was by being cops. So that's why you have terms like paddy wagon, and you have all these Irish celebrations from the whole Northeast when it comes to policing. But so I go into the military. I wanted to hone my stuff. I was not a jock, but I was an athlete, so I wanted to be able to do things. I wasn't big enough to play football going forward. So what was I going to do that was like in the same mentality? Well, going into Marine Corps sounded like a great plan to me. I wanted to go shoot things and run around and have fun. And you're kind of, the idea is you're serving this good overall purpose.
Mhm.
And so why not use your abilities to do that? Coming out of that, I always wanted to be a cop. I would watch cops on TV. Saw them always as a good regulating force growing up, and I wanted to be a cop. So went to Baltimore, where I thought, just like the Marine Corps, if you're going to be a soldier, you go into the Marines. If you're going to be a cop, you go to Baltimore. Where else are you going to go? So went back home, went to Baltimore. Uh, Ended up being a regular patrol officer, walking foot. I first started off in Freddie Gray's neighborhood, exactly where those films were taken. That was my first place where I was an officer.
Mhm.
Went through policing. As I got more involved in it and got into drugs, I started to see, being a drug detective, like just how pointless the drug war was. It was, maybe if you're not involved in it directly, you can think, well, locking 30 people up on a big drug raid solves an issue. But
Mhm.
when we do it, we make the big drug raid that took us 6 months of work, and then the next day we go out and there's just new faces doing the exact same goddamn thing all over again.
Yeah.
And now we have a worse situation because the money from the money income coming in from those people is gone to the community that they were giving it to. So now that community is more hopeless. There's a violence element that spreads in when you are just going for survival. So I don't even call that violence. Sometimes that branches into aggression, which is a different argument. That's when you have to commit an act of violence in order to survive, because you've already, there's a reason for this.
Yeah.
And so you get those kind of things in response, and it's like, well, wait, this has got to be making everything worse. Like, this can't be doing anything positive. So I started to really focus on the professionalism of policing and trying to think about doing all my research. Did my bachelor's in criminal justice, started doing promotional material for stuff, working on my own promotion to figure out what was perfect policing. How do you do this the best way possible in order to minimize the harm that we're doing and to maximize the benefit that we provide? And we can get into it, but eventually I realized that perfect policing is really just safely getting somebody to an improved cage. And that doesn't
And
make that doesn't make any sense.
what does that mean? What does that mean, an improved
So think
cage?
about any improvement that you're talking about when it comes to the common stereotype, or the common things that you're pushing for. So say
Mhm.
you're pushing for body cameras. The
Yeah.
only goal there, even so body cameras are a tool, and they're going to work for whoever's in control of the tool. Currently, police are in control of the tool, so it's going to be to their benefit almost always.
Yeah.
Because it's their tool. That's a whole separate discussion, that you think giving somebody else a tool to do their job will somehow improve your life. I don't get that argument.
Yeah.
But Where was I going? What were we talking about?
Well, basically, we're just kind of starting off with just kind of what got you into policing.
Oh, no, no, no,
Um,
perfect policing in a cage. Sorry.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
so,
policing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so what you end up trying to say there is really what you are the key goal is to get the person to the jail safely without being harmed so that they can then be in the best cage possible, because no one is trying, still no one in any of these reforms is trying to prominently fight the things that actually cause violence, and violence needs to be what we look at, because the reason for that is a clear point. Crime is a measurement of police activity, not of citizen activity. So
Correct.
police will find crime where they are. The fundamental point of it is where are the cops? Cops are placed in response to violence. Now, there's a reason the violence is there that we all have to be open and honest about why the violence is in Baltimore, being why policing is there. Now, is the policing the best response to that violence? The answer is no,
Right.
but that's the system and culture that we have now. So it's
Do
about
you, be-
changing policing to actually fight those causations. And no one in the prominent specter that you're going to hear of is actually arguing for things that do anything other than get the person to a better cage.
do you believe right now that policing is even done right?
No, what it really does at its current state is keep a lid on things. So I do think it is effective. I think the data is clear that it's effective. Its presence and availability is effective at keeping a lid on kind of societal control, which is a benefit that the whole world has kind of developed. Now, we developed it in America from a distinct roots. That's kind of why we stand out. Most policing developed directly from night watching, when we developed first from slave patrols, then evolved into night watching.
Yeah.
So that different history has some elements that linger in the system, and if you're not aware of those elements, then you will commit racist acts with no racism involved. And that's essentially what a black cop does. They're committing racist acts with no racism involved because they don't understand the system.
And it was kind of one of those things, like kind of starting off where policing started. Like policing started off with initial slave catchers, and then slave catchers turned into enforcing black codes after slavery was
Well, hold on.
abolished.
Let's talk about real quickly why. Like,
Okay.
see, we get caught up in thinking things are evilly intended. So this is like the crime bill. This had all these things have good intent. That's why it's super important to understand actually what we're talking about and how these things will play out in reality. So the intent of these slave patrols was they were from the north. They started in Massachusetts and Maine. So the point was is you catch runaway slaves from the south, because they didn't have the slaves up there. These were runaway slaves from the south, and they would come up to the north to try to hide. But in order to avoid a problem which could lead to now the north be having slaves all over the place, they decided what they needed to do was get people together to go out on these marches, essentially these night watches, where the whole goal was to catch runaway slaves, bring them back to the south so that there wasn't a beef between the north and the south. Now you can understand why somebody would want to try to create an atmosphere where they wanted to stand back, protect their own liberties, but not interfere with another country's actions. One of my big objections we could where I will piss somebody off is to recognize that the South was another country. It's not America. So I don't understand some of the tie-ins. That's not America. We went to war over this. They lost. They're gone. But
Yeah, exactly.
so so that comes into a haunt a lot of things in my ideologies. But the the those slave patrols now. So here's where it comes. So this is the first police. The first time you're collecting data. So remember, crime is a measurement of a police officer's activity, not a
Yeah.
citizen's activity. You don't know the crime that's uncaptured and unwritten by a cop. So what would happen is who's going to run away from slave patrols? Well, 16 to 24-year-old black males. Why? Because they're the most physically fit and capable of surviving on their own to run away. You're not going to be an 8-year-old girl and run away from the police. You're not going to be a 42-year-old woman and run away from the slave catchers in the South. You're going to stay around for your kids and stuff like that. So the man's going to go as soon as he's capable to try and forge a path and find something. So this is who you catch, this is who you have data, and this is where you begin to justify where you look next. Because if you're data driven and objective, you want to look to where the data is, and then the data starts with 16 to 24-year-old black males from the beginning. So you have that as part of your chain that's unavoidable.
But was it only? But that's the thing, though. Especially with slave catchers, is something I was very proponent and very specific based on race. The people that they
Sure.
were catching were the ones that were getting away, but it was the one group that was also being targeted.
Right, because they're the ones that are going to get that far north. It's kind of an instinct. Maybe it wasn't even true. It can be that's just where the police are. The assumption is, the logical assumption is who is physically capable of doing this and who do we care about coming into our neighborhood that shouldn't be here? Well, it's who's most physically capable. The black male that's 60, or not, not because they're black, but just because they're a male that's of that age, they're vastly more capable of doing something and surviving and fighting their way out of a situation, running, endurance. They're going to win, and they're going to be the ones that get away safely.
But isn't it still? I guess we're looking at property, so it's at the same time a 16 to 24-year-old white male, and I'm talking about back then, they were not being targeted
Of
by
course,
the.
of course. Yeah. So, but the reason is because there weren't white slaves, right? So it's not like necessarily you can say that someone's coming from a racial point when they're starting the slave patrol. There's just no, they know the South doesn't have white slaves, so why would they look for them? I mean, it's just it can, all these things tend to come from a good place, and that's why we have to remember that. I always point out when everything I was doing that I saw and everyone could think was bad was in a black city with a black police department, with a black mayor, with a black city council, with a black attorney general, with a black state's attorney, with a black president. You can't blame me in this chain.
But there's a
You can't
system that.
blame the puppet. You can't blame the weakest link. So we do that in policing, and we always do this, and it pisses me off so bad. Who is the focus right now in George Floyd's death? Derek Chauvin, the pawn. Every single person that created this pawn, built the pawn up, covered for the pawn for all these years, directed the pawn, trained the pawn, completely free. Not even a question.
I think they're all guilty, though. I think they're all at fault of the system, and I think what
Sure,
happens.
but that's not the focus. So the thing is what happens is when you get rid of Derek Chauvin, this system will now put in someone most likely who is worse because
Correct.
you worsen the scenario to begin with.
But I also believe that at the same time, I don't. I only think specific people are focusing on Derek Chauvin. I think the rest of, in regards to what's going on with the protests, it is fighting against the entire system: police brutality, police accountability. I think Derek Chauvin
Maybe,
just
maybe.
next line
So,
kind of.
so let me ask you this, really. I mean, let me blow your
Yeah,
mind with this one real quick. If that were
yeah,
true, so
yeah.
the theory there is we're fighting disproportional police violence, right?
I would go more than just police violence. I'd say accountability
But
and
we say
just.
Black lives because it's the idea that's most disproportional.
I won't only say that it's. I wouldn't only agree with that it's Black Lives on that. I think also another spot that people are forgetting with Black Lives Matter. I think it's usually the response when an African American is killed. There's always, well, what was he doing, or he was threatening. I think there's. It's not only the fact that a Black person was killed. It's always conveniently these exceptions always happen, and these arguments happen when a Black life is killed.
I don't think it's fair to think that it's only that way when the media doesn't report when it happens to other people.
I
So
think
when
they
a
do.
when a black cop kills a black cop, you don't hear about a black cop kills a black suspect, you don't hear about it. When a black cop kills a white victim, you don't hear about it. So if you had the other stories, that would make a lot more sense. So the most disproportional victim of police violence is white females by a fucking mile. And no one is talking about the disproportional violence on white females. So in
I
Minneapolis, two
Yeah,
white females were
yeah.
killed by black officers, and no one ever said a word, completely unarmed, executed on a public street by police officers. You don't hear about it. No one talks about it. There's no video body camera that anybody's protesting. But white females in Minneapolis, I couldn't even find one that was a suspect of a murder.
But the one in Minneapolis, there was the guy who
You're
shot and
talking about You're talking about
happened like
Justine
3 years ago.
Barron or something like that. Justine Barron, I think that was her name.
something like that.
So
And she got
so that was
kind of
one,
killed.
right? And then there was another white female that was killed by them. But you don't hear about it. You don't hear people talking about the disproportionality of that. So that's my thing, that it's not principled in what we're actually fighting. If we don't have a message on what we're fighting, I think a lot of things get lost. And that's been my experience, is that when I go and talk to people, there isn't a coherent narrative. And I think a leaderless system has really been the problem there. If we look at Martin Luther King, here's what I'm going to tell you. White America completely adopted Martin Luther King's principles. Completely.
How?
They agree to be judged by the merit and the content of their skin, content of their character, not the color of their skin. They have really bought into this narrative. So now
I don't believe that that's true. I don't believe that's actually happening.
I know that it's easy to think that. I get it. But I've been there. I've talked to these people. I've tried to hear it out. I've got into it. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems that I've had is people were very understanding when I was trying to preach empathy for the poor black kid on the corner. But when I try to flip that empathy on the poor white kid who's trying to survive and is being overdosed and has the highest suicide rate in the nation, people aren't willing to flip their empathy.
Because I think we're fighting two different things. I think one is a systemic issue, and one is a kind of
No,
personal.
no,
There's
I
history
totally disagree.
related to that.
So the whole system goes after class. It does not go after race. It simply doesn't. There
Which
are
just
the whole policing system, criminal justice system. It goes after class. It doesn't go after. So Will Smith's kids have there is no white kid born in West Virginia has an advantage over Will Smith's kids. If you think they do, you're living in another planet. These things are all class based. Now, these happen to white people, but that doesn't evoke the response. So, again, last year, 19 unarmed white people, white men, were killed by police officer, nine
right.
black. Okay. Now, the problem here is I've broken this math down in other issues, but the bottom line is that when 3% of the population commits 53% of the violence, then you have to understand where some of that disproportionality is going to come from, because police respond to violence, not to crime. They respond to violence, and then crime is created by their activity there. So when police are assigned to an area like Baltimore, the violence is there, and that is not their fault. They do things that continue that, not understanding the legacy of that system. So the people are violent more so because of the legacy of this system than the police are bad. There are elements of the police, but to think that if you think that because you're white, you have any level of protection against being executed by the state, you are out of your mind.
I won't even deny it, because at
Right.
the
So
same
that's what I'm
time,
saying, is this is not race based when it comes to police intent. Now the problem is so they're in these neighborhoods thinking they're doing good, but what the system has structured isn't actually beneficial. So it's based off of rational choice. Rational choice is like, so you could have police there and then people will decide, oh, I'm not going to commit an act of violence because this cop is there. Well, that's been completely disproven in the science without question. Violence will be committed because it is a biological response to something. You cannot, the death penalty, for example, doesn't work. You can't say, I'm going to kill you if you commit this act of violence. It has no deterrent effect
exactly.
whatsoever. So the nation as a whole and policing as a whole believe that being the bigger bully is a deterrent for violence, and it's not.
It's not
So
at all.
so the whole, but that's my thing, is the whole society needs to understand first that this response doesn't work. Are there elements in it that are good and bad? Yes, but it is the very minutia of the system where we are looking at difference in racial systems. We're really looking at class differences. And the reason why blacks are stuck in lower classes, now that has a long history of
There's
solid
red
institutional
line.
racism.
Yeah.
So I'll get into it right away. The number one reason why violence is committed in America and around the world is environmental poisoning, most specifically lead poisoning. Now, black people in America are poisoned by lead at a wildly disproportional rate because of the racism in the past of America. So the reason they're poisoned as children by lead paint, because you're trapped in poverty areas when things like redlining in Baltimore took place, or being a slave and going with less resources, and so you don't have home ownership, so you're trapped into you're trapped into the lower class. The thing is, this applies to every race and creed of the bottom lower classes. Now you're disproportionately in the lower class for a reason. That's a problem. And being disproportionately in the lower class means you have wildly more people who are lead poisoned through the paint, through the copper pipes not being replaced because of slum landlords and things like that who aren't taking care of these properties. And then you have corrupt governments who are siphoning off money, not actually taking care of these properties. And then you have an area like Baltimore who ends up with lead poisoning in the ground, lead poisoning in the paint, and lead poisoning in the water. Freddie Gray was lead poisoning police victims. Most of these police victims are going to be lead poisoned. Corinne Grins was lead poison victim. So what happens is you're poisoned as a child, and then 18 years later, when you're in this 16 to 24-year-old black male range, you are now physically, you have been poisoned by lead. Lead causes your medulla oblongata to shrink. You have less impulse control and vastly more violent, and you have a
Oh,
lower IQ. This
wait,
is what
hold
lead
on, hold
poisoning
on.
does.
I got to stop you right there because what happened was, in regards to Freddie Gray, is much different. That his spine was severed when
No,
he was
this
in.
has to do with his health, like his ability for his spine to be severed, and why he was doing what he was doing.
But again, your job as policing is to
No, my
arrest.
point is that he, even as an innocent kid here, is a victim of this lead poisoning. This is somebody just to identify with. Just because he was there is why he was lead poisoned. The mere fact that he was born in this neighborhood is why he had lead poisoning. And his lead poisoning made him have less impulse control. Now, that led to different issues throughout his life.
Hold
This
on,
is a fact. I mean, he sued people for this.
I understand
This
that,
is
but then
his claim.
hold on, but then
Yeah.
hold on. We also have to then, if we do that, we're taking away complete accountability from the police officers. Because
No,
again, if we're
not no
saying
no
that
no
that's
no no
happening to
no no.
Freddie Gray,
Separate issues. Separate issues. Okay. So police policy and practice is a whole different discussion than what causes these interactions. Right? So these interactions, when you're talking about violence, police are placed where violence is. So why is the violence occurring is the question. The question on why violence is occurring is lead. Now, in 1974, the CAFE standards went in with the gasoline, and we got lead out of the gasoline. That lead, because there's a delay. Remember, you poison a child. It only happens to children. If you're poisoned as an adult, this doesn't happen to you. You must be poisoned as a child. So,
can I ask
yeah,
you a question real quick?
yeah.
Because would you say that you have lead poisoning?
Do I?
Yeah.
Oh, most likely not. There'd be no reason.
Well, but that's the thing though, because you're saying you're basing it based off of violence, but then you're telling me the reason that you got into policing and get into the Marine Corps was because it's kind of perpetuation for for violence.
No,
You
let's break
wanted
that
to get
down.
out.
Okay, so one of my biggest evolutions is there's two different things. You have violence and you have aggression. I'm aggressive. Acts of violence are not controlled. So the instance there, when somebody goes and murders somebody, and you hear them say, "Oh my God, I can't believe he would do this. This isn't like him." Totally agree with you. Acts of violence are a biological malfunction. The primary purpose of the human being is to cooperate. Our number one advantage over all other species is these extreme levels of cooperation. And so we are literally evolved and at our core programmed to actually cooperate with one another. When we commit acts of violence on one another, this is literally biological. Something is happening in the brain. Impulse control has been lost. We are subject to something that is going on in our environment. We feel like we have to do this in order to survive. This is just the way it is. So, I mean, what would it take for you to commit an act of violence?
I think everyone has an act of violence. If we go back to slave catchers and not slave catchers into slave owners who were beating their slaves every single day, that
Oh, they
I
were
don't.
they could have been lead poisoned as well.
Yeah, but if
So
you're saying that could have been, it's like basically taking away all
no, no,
accountability.
no. So we have to understand violence is a biological malfunction. So it happens for different reasons. You can have lack of nutrition. You can have no water, right? So you change, you biologically change, and you will be willing to kill somebody you didn't think you were willing to kill about 36 hours from now if you don't get any water. You can have it could be from a tumor in your brain. It can be from a whole bunch of different things. But the number one cause is lead poisoning. That's what I'm talking about. The number one correlate to violence is lead poisoning. So you could type on your computer right now, lead poisoning violence correlation. You will see exact duplicate parallels on an 18 to 22-year delay because this is when people are hitting the system with their violence. So I understand this is pushing you off, but what is your reason why black males commit 53% of violence.
That they commit 53% of violence? I think, again, we're looking at two completely different things, in my opinion, because we're looking at one way of violence and depends on who's recording it. Now,
No,
we have to
no,
understand.
no, 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 no,
Well,
no, no, no.
but let me finish
Violence. Who is killing bodies? The only stat we have is homicides. Everything else is a measurement of police activity. Homicides. That's our only goal. That's our only stat that we know is solid.
I'm gonna. There's another question I'm gonna ask you as well,
Yeah.
and it's further down the conversation, but it's like you're saying that these people are committing the violence or committing the violence.
That's an indisputable fact.
Right. Okay, but then also, what percentage of these people are in jail that have not faced trial? Because I think we have to look at that as well.
Of who? No, 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 no.
Of people that are people. We're in a situation where most of the people of color.
We don't know how to prove or demonstrate that what a police officer did was violence and not aggression, and the law doesn't make that distinction either. So the difference between aggression is when a country goes to war, that soldier that volunteers to defend his country is not going out there with the sense of that they're going to go commit violence on another person. What they're doing is survival aggression. They feel that the best overall outcome through what's going on around them, that this will be what protects their family. This will be what protects their land. Okay, that's forced violence. That's very different, because with policing, they have a job that you as a community has asked them to do. So it's no way, there's no ability to determine whether they were doing unless you're going to get into a minority report, there's no way to determine that they didn't feel in their intent that they were doing the best thing for that community. Just because they're wrong doesn't make them violence. Yeah.
All right, then let's step back a little bit.
So police go to who's violent. So who's committing the violence?
Well, let me step back a little bit, because I think this is a perfect time to come up with the tweets in regards to when you decided to speak out against police misconduct and police brutality. Because again, would you consider what you witnessed as violence? Would you consider what you saw as aggression?
I'm not the type of person that ever thinks I can tell somebody else's intent. I don't play that game. I don't know what somebody else's intent is, and I'll never get into it. What I'm telling you is the facts of what I saw. And what I think happens now when I talk to anyone in your position at the moment and the way you're thinking is the exact same struggle. My struggle with the police department then was that they were denying lived reality and facts. So my problem is at the time, the police union, Freddie Gray had just been killed. Okay. And the police union, the politicians, and everyone involved with policing was saying that the Baltimore Police Department did nothing wrong.
Yeah.
And I felt that was just prima facie nonsense, that you're going to tell me that you can take a man off the street with no offense, put him into a van, and deliver him to his death, and you didn't do anything wrong. That is absolutely mind-blowing cognitive dissonance. Yeah. So I said, if we want to pretend like we don't do anything wrong, let's talk about the reality of what we do. And I started just tweeting things that I thought maybe not necessarily that they would be shocking to the public. I thought that these would be the things that would piss my police friends off. Like, these are the things that if you said they happened in front of their wife, they would be like, no, we don't do that. Oh, that never happened. They would deny that to their family, that they kicked some handcuffed suspect. They would deny to their family that they punched somebody in the face. They would deny to their family that they did these things, right?
So what did you see exactly? Because I think one of them from, you saw a detective slapping a completely innocent female in the face for bumping into him. Coming out.
Yeah, and I'm not even know if bumping into him was her fault. That could have very well been his fault. I mean, that much of but that guy was a dick, and so.
Would you count that as violence or aggression?
That dude was violence.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I guess, what about pissing and shitting inside suspects' homes during raids on their beds and clothes?
That was a one-time incident that people like to focus on, but I did not know those people. But this is a cool point to get into. Yeah. Is one thing to understand about me is I was in a bubble as well. One thing that I have learned once I saw some of the other stories come out about police getting arrested, I when I had a rule that I would never snitch on you, and I've still never snitched on another cop. But if I was getting there pressured, I'm not gonna lie about it. Like, you're out of your mind. If you think I'm gonna, like, if I'm getting pressured by IED or anybody's asking me, I'm telling right away. So things didn't happen around me. That the people who kind of followed the rules, they ended up in these own little groups. I ended up in this major case narcotics squad that did these big investigations, but because they were detailed investigations that go under federal scrutiny, all these people in my squad, they were all pretty good. Like, these were all honorable people. The problem was, is like when we would go in joint raids and then we would cross over with the other units, or I would be out doing covert and see things where they didn't know I was there. Then I would see them and be like, what the hell? Like, so even though I would even know some of these people, I never saw a lot of this until there was exceptional circumstances.
Okay, so like all the stuff that you kind of posted were like those are kind of the extent of
Yeah, these aren't
the
even
stuff.
people. I mean, I might know their names, but that's as far as it goes. These weren't people I worked around because what happens is these people cluster.
Yeah.
So I don't even, I realized that I was blind to a lot of what was happening in the police department. And one reason, and that I know is not going to rub you the right way as well, is that police are arrested for their crimes and convicted at a wildly disproportional rate than the general public. I realized that I had been working with more cops that had been arrested than suspects I arrested. And I thought that was absolutely mind blowing. And the thing is, you just don't hear about it. Cops get DUIs, they get assault charges, and they actually get convicted to longer periods. I understand that there are anecdotes that exist out there, but every time, for instance, every time a cop does something, like say a cop takes $5 from a suspect, right? And it's a drug thing where they're just really essentially stealing $5. What they end up getting is armed robbery because all cops are armed. So they end up getting way higher sentences and way different portrait when what happens is, say a cop searching somebody, he takes $5 out of that guy's pocket and he slips it into his and goes on. Really, that's a theft. But you don't hear it as a theft. You hear it as an armed robbery, and they're charged as an armed robbery. And if that would have happened to a person with a concealed carry permit or something like that, you wouldn't get armed robbery. So by the nature of their job, they do get escalated sentences. It's just not true. And I know it feels that way, but I have been deep in the data. Everyone, I have my PhD. Is police management is my worldly focus. I care everything about this subject. And when I say 3% of the population are committing 53% of the violence, and that must be faced honestly before we can address police reform or address police reform in any honest fashion, it's the same thing as me saying, look, we're as a police officers, as police departments, we are all covering for one another as these acts are committed, these crimes are committed in front of us. Even though we are convicted at a vastly disproportional rate than the general public, we have a responsibility to constantly improve. Policing might only be 10% bad. And my goal is, this is just theoretical. So
Okay.
my purpose is to make it 91% better, 92% better, 93%, and just keep escalating it as far as I can go. But a lot of people are taking the position that the 90% doesn't actually exist, that the vast majority of instances aren't beneficial, that most of these neighborhoods would desperately plead for their police department and their police officers to not leave their side. Now, there's a certain element that sees the police in a wildly different way. I mean, police officers in Baltimore, they're not out there committing acts of violence against a 50-year-old and older grandmothers. So the police, the grandmother who called the police on Tamir Rice, the grandmother who called 911 on me all day long to get drug dealers off her corner, she sees the police as a good force and that's something that would never do anything to harm her. And she's absolutely right. So the problem that I have is I start telling people, and they don't like to hear it, but when you want to ask who the Baltimore Police Department is working for, sure, there are elements where they're working for the elite, but the vast majority of calls, the vast majority of work ethic, the Baltimore Police Department serves adult Black residents in the city in poor neighborhoods. Bottom line. That's the truth.
Well, I guess we're going to go into a little bit, because there's some spots that you touched on, because you said stuff about robberies, like, but what about stuff like civil forfeitures, which I think never even get talked
Terrible,
about.
terrible.
Terrible.
Okay,
Because
yes.
in 2004, you're saying about robbery. In 2014, the cops took $5 billion from civilians. And that year, robbers took 3.5 billion. So you're saying that they get charged in the exact same way, but you're looking at $1.5 billion.
Right, but they're doing something
took from
legal,
robbers.
so you can't blame the police department for doing again. So here's a problem that I think we have. We, as a group, as a whole country, think that the link between the people and the police department has been severed, and that's just not true.
I think honestly it's this. I did a ride along one day, and what happened was I was going through the police station, and as I was going through, I noticed that, one of the officers was watching Fox News. That's fine. He was watching Fox News, but what he was saying was, these guys are going to protect us. Now, in regards to policing, I believe what we're seeing is an ideological kind of impasse, where I believe that a lot of the people that cops are mainly attacking are people that are kind of speaking out against them. Like, I started doing research. It's like, why am I not seeing videos of police brutality against people with Confederate flags on the back of their car, or
Hold on, stop. Why? No, answer the question. Why?
That's what I'm saying.
Because they don't commit acts of violence.
Who do not commit acts of violence?
Poor white people. The disproportionate rate is police are in response to violence. If white males suddenly start committing all the violence, the police will look at them more. The problem is police are where they are placed. Where does murder occur? Where does murder occur? Where does murder occur?
Bigger cities, because there's bigger populations.
Not bigger cities. Not true. New York City, 174 murders to 200 murders. The safest city in the safest city in the entire country. Now, click on Google and see which city has the lowest lead levels in the entire nation. Hint, hint, New York City.
So then then I'm going to bring that in. If you're going to say that they're going to be brought into certain places, then what about Terry stops and stop and frisk? Which was
that was before the lead got out. So the lead's out now. So what happened is the lead being out of the water, New York's public health department in the 80s started working on getting lead the lowest levels in the nation in New York. They succeeded. The New York City Public Health Department is the heroes of New York City's crime reduction. New York City went from one of the most violent cities in the country to the least violent city in the country during the time of stop and frisk. So a lot of people were buying into it because the crime was going down at the same time they were doing stop and frisk. But the crime was going down because there were 18 to 22-year delay from when they got lead levels at the lowest. Children in New York City are not being lead poisoned. So they are not continuing to grow up to commit acts of violence. Violence is lead poisoning. And look, I am not alone. There are Black scholars in every HBCU that will preach the same thing I'm hearing, but they're drowned out by the voices of people like DeRay McKesson making $150,000 a year, who are really nothing but rich white neoliberals running the movement and the voice of everyone that happens. Just like in Standing Rock, when the voices that got heard were none of the goddamn voices that needed to be heard, everything becomes commercialized. This movement is completely commercialized, ignoring the voices of the people who are down on these cities, caring about this shit. This has become a white neoliberal movement. That is my bottom line position. Black Lives Matter. These protests, it doesn't have shit to do with police brutality, doesn't have shit to do with these neighborhoods, doesn't have shit to do with